Almost 18 months into the war in Ukraine, there's no end in sight to the conflict. Ukraine's promised counteroffensive is progressing slower than expected, with Russian forces digging in on the front line. So where to next, and what will it take to end this war? Global Affairs Editor John Lyons is with me in the studio. Hi there, John. So let's start at the beginning. What was the situation before the invasion?
Ros, of course, February 2022, the Russians built up as many as 100,000 troops along the border with Ukraine. Many people, including in Ukraine, Ukrainians I've spoken to when I've been there, didn't think Russia would invade, that it was typical Vladimir Putin bluff. Of course he did. He tried to take the capital, Kyiv, and of course the Ukrainians have put up a remarkable response.
So where are Russian forces now?
Well, Russian forces now have moved into, they beforehand controlled those two areas around Donetsk and Crimea from 2014, but now the red areas, of course, they have moved into, that's about 20% of Ukraine, which they've now taken and occupied. The Ukrainians, of course, are trying to push them back.
So the Ukrainian counteroffensive has been ongoing, for a few weeks now. How's that going?
It's going very slowly. It's not as dramatic as everybody thought. The areas in yellow there, of course, you can see are the areas that that Ukraine has recaptured, deoccupied, if you like. You can see it's a very small part of the place. But now, of course, they're trying to use more aerial arsenal to try to take further areas.
So what's the strategy going forward for Ukraine?
The strategy, from talking to people when I was in Ukraine, is essentially the jewel in the crown is Crimea. They very much want to retake Crimea. They think that would be the biggest political blow to Vladimir Putin. So what they want to do to take Crimea, their strategy is where those arrows are. Essentially, the plan they want is to come down and through Melitopol and cut off Melitopol. If they can do that and destroy the bridge down in Crimea, they can essentially isolate.
Let's look more closely at Crimea then. How significant is it to both sides, John?
Well, it means everything. Because it was the first of the major parts of Ukraine to go back in 2014, that's the one that the Ukrainians really want to take. It's also strategically so important in terms of trade into the Black Sea. So what the Ukrainians have been doing now more than once is attacking that Kerch bridge. So if they can destroy the bridge and come down through Melitopol, they isolate, and they want to then strangle the Russian soldiers in that area, cut their supplies off, strangle them like a boa constrictor.
Well, there have been multiple attacks on the Kerch bridge. How effective have they been?
Well, the Russians keep rebuilding it, and in fact we see there one of the dramatic attacks. Vladimir Putin, of course, himself has reopened the bridge once. It is so important to both sides. Most of the supply, or much of the supply lines for the Russian troops are coming in through that bridge. That's the reason the Ukrainians are targeting it.
OK. Well, Ukraine has been lobbying Western nations heavily for more weapons. What are they after, and how much difference would those weapons make?
They've realised, Ros, with the counter-offensive that the Russians have fortified the front line so heavily. It's a 1,200-kilometre front line, and the Russians have put landmines and trenches and barbed wire. So now the Ukrainians are switching to an aerial strategy. F-16s they want primarily. Their pilots have been trained with F-16s, and they're to be delivered, some F-16s there in coming weeks. On top of that, of course, they want general attacks from the air, cluster bombs from the US, which have just arrived in the last 2 weeks. So they want to hit the Russian soldiers with the cluster bombs. They also are going for long-range missiles. Both the British and the French have given them long-range cruise missiles that have a range of 250 kilometres. Again, all designed at that strategy of trying to hit deep into Ukraine, the Kerch Bridge and other places.
And of course, John, this war not only impacts Russia and Ukraine, it has global impacts. One of the only diplomatic successes of the war was a grain deal, but now that's collapsed.
That has collapsed. Ukraine is often called the breadbasket of Europe. The World Food Programme, which feeds Africa and many poor parts of the world, gets 50% of its grain from Ukraine. The Russians are now saying we will reserve the right to bomb any ships that are going through the Black Sea, whether they're military or not. So now what the Ukrainians are trying to do to keep their grain trade alive, because it's harvest time, is they're now trying to bring some of the grain through Romania so it can come out on ships from Romania. But it's much more costly and slower.
John, thank you.
Thank you.